All right, so with spongy bone, with spongy bone, the struts that are referred to as trabeculae, they branch out in different directions. Some are parallel, but they kind of crisscross throughout the tissue that we call spongy bone to still give a structural reinforcement by the trabeculae, but the spaces help lighten up this type of bone so it's not as heavy or as dense as a compact bone, but still relatively strong. And the structural components of spongy bone are referred to as trabeculae. There's no osteon structure within spongy bone. It's just the trabeculae that supply the strength of spongy bone. And the spaces are filled with red bone marrow in the enlarged epiphyses of bone, and down along the shaft or the diaphysis of long bones, the spongy bone surrounds what's called the medullary cavity, where you would find yellow bone marrow. So again, the trabeculae provide strength, but helps reduce weight or mass. Otherwise, if this area, this epiphysis, this enlarged area of bone, was filled only with compact bone, it would be very strong, but it would be also very heavy. It would be prohibitively heavy, making our skeletal system too heavy for our bodies. Okay, let's look at long bone anatomy. We've talked about it a little bit, but let's get some of the terminology down. So the walls of long bones, and actually all bones, have a sheet, a layer, outer layer of compact bone, and in some places it's thicker than in other places, depending on the stress that that portion of the bone is experiencing. Internally, there is compact bone. The long bone anatomy, there's three basic regions. There's the epiphysis, proximal and distal. Proximal would mean closer to the body, the torso, for example, and then distal meaning further away. So this would be the knee joint of this thigh bone or femur, and this is where the hip joint would be. So this is the proximal epiphysis, and that would be the distal epiphysis. So two of them is epiphyses. They're resistance to forces in multiple directions, which is why the trabeculae within the spongy bone are oriented in different directions. The elongated portion is called the shaft or diaphysis. Either term is fine. And it's resistant to tension and compression, mostly in one direction, which is why the shaft or diaphysis has a relatively thick collar of compact bone. And then finally, the metaphysis is the region of the long bone that's between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So an metaphysis down here as well. So there's a proximal metaphysis and a distal metaphysis. Plural would be metaphyses. Right? So zooming into long bone anatomy, here's the epiphysis filled with spongy bone, distal epiphysis filled with spongy bone. Diaphysis or shaft has a space in the center called the medullary cavity. So again, the epiphyses filled with spongy bone, and there's a distal and proximal epiphysis, that enlarged region of the bone. So here are the stem cells for blood cell production, comprising what we call red bone marrow. Within the diaphysis or shaft, there is a collar, external collar of compact bone, surrounding the central space called the medullary cavity. And there's a relatively thin region on the inner surface of the diaphysis, a relatively narrow or thin area of compact bone. Sorry, spongy bone. Okay? The outer collar, if you will, is compact bone, and the inner surface has a thin layer of spongy bone at the diaphysis, or the shaft of a long bone. And then that space in the center again is the medullary cavity, or the marrow cavity, filled with yellow marrow, fat storage. Lining the articulating joint ends of the epiphyses is articular hyaline cartilage. Shock absorption and a smooth surface for joints. There are openings into the bones for the blood vessels and in nerves, innervation, and these openings are called nutrient foramina is plural. One of them is a nutrient foramen. Remember, living bones are living tissue, so they need a blood supply. And if you look at a bone, this is dead bone, but you'll see these openings kind of at a relatively sharp angle, and that's a nutrient foramen, and that would be the passageway for blood supply and innervation into a bone. So the periosteum is that membrane that covers the outer surface of the bone, essentially everywhere except where the bone is covered with articulating hyaline cartilage. It isolates and protects bones from surrounding tissues, has an wow, that's a good word. It has an outer fibrous layer, which is dense fibrous connective tissue, what we see here in gray, outermost layer of the periosteum. The inner layer is called the cellular osteogenic layer, here in pink. And here we have a population of osteoprogenitor, osteoblast, and osteoclast cells. And if you remember from a little bit earlier, the osteoprogenitor cells are stem cells that can differentiate into osteoblasts. They would build bone by secreting osteoid. If they get encased with solid bone material, then those osteoblasts differentiate into osteocytes. Then also the osteoclast cells are those cells that resorb or dissolve solid bone matrix. So all those types of cells would be found within the inner cellular osteogenic layer of the periosteum. So again, the periosteum is on the surface of the bone, everywhere except where tendons, ligaments, and or cartilage are found. And a tendon or a ligament, a tendon attaches muscle to bone, and the ligament attaches bone to bone. And we'll revisit this when we do joints. So let's go back to here. So everywhere along the bone there's the periosteum, except where there's cartilage, articulating cartilage on the epiphyses. And then also kind of along the epiphyses is where you would have ligaments and tendons attaching bone to bone, ligament helping bind the joint, and then tendons binding the bone to a muscle. So we'll revisit those type of structures when we look at articulations or joints. This figure shows you periosteum in pink, covering the surface of the bone, except where there's hyaline cartilage. Okay, and then about here and about here would be where ligaments and tendons would be attached. All right, so then the endosteum, peri meaning on the outside of the bone, osteum, bone, endo is internal lining. So the endosteum is a cellular lining of the marrow cavity, inner lining, and also extends into the epiphyses where we have spongy bone. So in the marrow cavity, there's a thin layer of spongy bone, and it's covered with the endosteum. Kind of like if you spray painted this, and the paint would be the cellular endosteum lining within the marrow cavity. And just like with the periosteum on the outer surface, the endosteum, the inner surface of the marrow cavity, has a population of osteoprogenitor, osteoblast, and osteoclast cells that are doing the same function as they did or as they do with the periosteum, differentiating into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts build bone material. If they get encased in bone material, they become osteocytes, and then the osteoclasts resorb or dissolve solid bone material. So again, these populations of cells are involved in bone repair and bone reshaping or bone remodeling. Okay, classification of bones. Long bones are called long bones because they're longer than they are wide, like your femur, thigh bone, tibia, shin bone, humerus, upper arm bone, radius and ulna, your forearm bones, but also your digits and your toes and your fibula are all considered long bones. They have 2 epiphyses, 2 metaphyses, and the diaphysis or the shaft, and a space in the center, the marrow cavity, as we've discussed in the basic bone anatomy. Flat bones, excuse me, where's my cursor? Here we go. Flat bones are flat, even though they may be curved, but they have a flat bone structure. These are the bones that form the cranium, roof of the skull, but also the scapula, your, what are scapula called? Shoulder blades, yes, and then the ribs as well. Even though they're elongated, the ribs are considered flat bones because they don't have the marrow cavity inside. Flat bones have an outer layer of compact bone, inner layer of compact bone, and internally just spongy bone that's referred to as the diploe. So they're thin, flat bones with an inner compact bone structure. Sutural bones. A suture is where bones meet. So sutural bones form in between the sutures of the skull, as we'll talk about later when we do the skull. And they're variable in size and number. Most people have them. So this is a back view of the skull or cranium. So these 2 large bones and this bone are the 2 parietal bones and the occipital bone. And the joint between them is called the suture. So sutural bones form between the sutures, and again, just like we see here, they're variable in size and in number. Irregular bones have an irregular shape, like the vertebra, the backbones, and some of the skull bones, particularly the face, are irregular in shape. Complex shapes with variable internal structures. Oh, here's a picture of a few sutural bones. That's a sutural bone, that's one, and this is actually a really large sutural bone. Compare this figure to this one. Here we only see like 1, 2 sutural bones. Here we see 1, 2 medium-sized one and a big one. And in this skull, 10 sutural bones. Notice that they are all variable in size, but they're found in the junction between the cranial bones, meaning at the sutures. Short bones are short, kind of cube-shaped or ice cube-shaped in a way, and most of them are in the wrist, carpals, and the tarsals in the ankles. Somewhat box-like or ice cube shape. Compact bone covering an inner core of spongy bone. And then sesamoid bones we'll cover in the next lecture.